Welcome everybody. I think that our guests are joining, so I take this time to let everybody join us. This is the first event that we organize with the Institute for European Policy Making in 2025, so I'm particularly glad to chair this discussion. My name is Stefano Feltri. I'm a journalist working with the Institute, and I will just moderate the event while the two speakers are two very familiar faces for the audience that regularly follows our event. Because we have Catherine de Vries, who is the president of the Institute for European Policy Making, and she is a political scientist, and she has written many times during the last year and a half about transatlantic relationship, and now the time has come to get to the conclusions of this conversation, because we are hosting this event just before the inauguration day by Donald Trump. We'll discuss on the long-term perspective, not focusing on the recent details. And then we have Isabell Hoffmann. She has already joined us many times with in our events, and we are very grateful to have her with us because she's a founder with Catherine, and now she's in charge of this project called eupinions at the Bertelsmann's Stiftung. And this is something extremely important to us because they regularly survey European member states' opinions, citizens' opinions, and now this time they also surveyed US people in order to assess the state of transatlantic relationship at the eve of the second presidency of Donald Trump. So we will, on the backdrop of this survey that Isabell will present to us, we will discuss basically the most important topic that we can face in these days: how the EU should and will react to a second Trump presidency. Are we doomed? Is this maybe an opportunity? Should we focus on values, or should we adopt a transactional approach, as Donald Trump apparently invite us to do? These are super important questions that will stay with us for a long time in the next months. But today is just the beginning of the conversation, and I think we have the best people to start this discussion. So, with no further ado, I leave the floor to Isabell for her introductory presentation. Then we will move to Catherine for her comments and ideas, and then I hope that we can have a lively discussion with all you who are attending the webinar. Isabell, the floor is yours, and thank you again for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Stefano. Thank you for inviting me again. It's always a great pleasure to be with you. Flaminia, would you be so kind and start this very short presentation I prepared? I promise it's going to be just a little bit of data and a couple of initial thoughts to kick off our conversation. So, whilst thinking about this event, we can start with this slide. This is perfectly fine. I realized the global order really is back on the center stage of things. I think that was my initial thought, listening and reading the press coverage and reflecting on what happened in the last couple of months as basically the world public sphere got trumped up to what is now going to start as a second Trump term. So isn't it funny that you feel that he has been president for at least this six month passing? He is more in the public eye, more in the public debate, more in focus. You couldn't believe that it's actually only starting this week. European elites mostly behave, let me put it like this, like deer in the headlights. They try to cover up in different ways, but and they try to engage in different ways. But there's a general sense that of anxious awakening of what's going to happen once the crew really gets back into power. The European public, on the other hand, seems to take a rather different approach, and I'm going to present data in a bit that we believe that it's fair to assume that they're rather unmoved by his re-election, at least in the short term. So we published in November last year a study, it's called Old Habits Die Hard, in which we looked at the state of the transatlantic partnership in the wake of the US election, because it was based on data that we collected in September. And what we mainly found can be wrapped up in, well, 80 years of prime partnership certainly have created a solid base of mutual appreciation and similar sensitivities, right? So Europeans and Americans still see in each other the most valuable ally. NATO is highly regarded. On the value side, cooperation on international affairs trumps competition and confrontation. However, what we also see is that 8 years of American hyperpolarization at home and mixed messaging abroad had taken their toll. And it was very interesting to observe that in September 2024, 63% of Europeans agreed that it is time for Europe to go its own way. And we had asked this question back in 2017 as well. And back in 2017, you could only find 25% of Europeans who would give you the same answer. So this is a huge shift in attitudes that we observe from 2017 to today. So at the top of my presentation, I said the European public seems to be rather unmoved by his re-election. That means in the short term, but in the long term, we see a very sustainable shift in attitudes towards the transatlantic partnership. With this publication in November, there were certain questions that came back to us. One touched upon the date of the data collection, September, so before the election in November and not after the election in November. And there was another question we got approached with, and that is the role of Russia, because in the most valuable ally question, we did not include Russia. And there were people who were speculating or wondering whether that would have changed the picture. And since we collect data every 3 months in all of the EU, by the way, so we interview in every country in every language of the member states. We went back in December and asked a couple of questions again. And I'm going to present you just a couple of slides, just 2 slides, to be very precise, to show you that this shift that I just presented to you, so from the one hand, most valuable ally is, of course, the US, by far, in all these institutions, and also the value-based are still ranking very high in the consciousness of Europeans. On the other way, so many people say it is time for Europe to go its own way. But this shift has nothing to do with the re-election of Donald Trump. It was true in September 24, and it was true in December 24, and that points to the fact that there is a deeper shift in attitudes that can be observed. Well, there are other sustainable changes in the data. I'm not going to present it, but I'm just going to allude to it. Whenever we ask questions around defense and security, right now they get very strong support. European defense is very high on people's minds right now. When we asked, we see that there is a strong sense of being together in security and defense issues, instead of the countries going alone. So that's one point. The other point is that there's very high general stress levels that we can measure. Unsurprisingly, one might say. And the third point is that obviously economic worries have deepened very much. And we see that these obviously create also trouble on the political home front rather than on the world stage. So I think the final question that we are facing now, and that I think Catherine is going to pick up on, is how can European leaders defend the global order whilst coping with the political backlash? Before I throw this question at Catherine and let her handle it, I'm going to just show you very quickly the data that I brought to you, because I think it's quite interesting. And that's a little fun fact for the Italian audience as well. So if we can please see the next slide, that would be lovely. Okay, wonderful. So the question I'm going to present is the first one. You see it right here. Who's the European Union most valuable ally? I should have mentioned that the data we collected in December, we only collected it in the EU. And what you see here is the September data for the EU and the September data and the December data for the EU. And you see roughly that there is basically no change. So if anything, the importance of the US has been going up, slightly going up, not much. The only country where you can see a difference is Italy. In Italy, you have a real jump in people who claim that the US is the most important ally. And if I'm informed correctly, then there has been a lot of press coverage, at least in the rest of the Union. And I suppose it has been even more intense in Italy itself about the relationship of your prime minister with not only Donald Trump, but also with his most important wingman, Elon Musk. You know, one might speculate, but my assumption would be that there's some part can be explained by this very interesting move in the numbers. But more importantly, I would like to draw your attention to Russia, because that was one of the questions that was brought back to us. So how does Russia basically figure into this most valuable ally? And I think there is a back thought to this, that Russia plays such an important role in the minds of Europeans, and that a significant amount of people who would maybe pick Russia as an important ally. However, you can see here that it didn't really change the picture. And the amount of people who actually picked Russia as an important ally are on the levels of people who picked China, Canada, a little bit more than Japan, Saudi Arabia, or Israel. So I thought it was really interesting to see that even though obviously Russia is a very important, visible, powerful player within our neighborhood, there are rather few people, not only in the EU as a whole, but also in the different member states that we poll separately, that actually would see Russia as an ally. The second question I would like to present data to, and it would be lovely to see the next chart, is this one. So the question was, in the last century, Europe and the United States have often cooperated closely. Do you think that it is time for the EU to go its own way? And here you clearly see a very stable picture, right? A very high number of people telling us, yes, it is time for the EU to go its own way. I think I cannot emphasize enough how big this change actually is, and that this is a real change in mentality that we see here, and that we have absolutely hardly any answer on how this is going to be translated politically. And I think it is very fitting to this day that we are going to look at it and think about how this will be translated politically. And with this, I would like to hand over to Catherine for the political implication of the situation. Thank you very much. And I think we probably can close the presentation now as I...
Exactly.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Isabel. Also, thank you so much, Stefano, for introducing. And as Stefano already said, and also was clear from Isabel, we've been working quite some time together to think about these questions about what shapes European public opinion about important issues such as, in this case, the transatlantic relationship. And we saw some differences also between countries, but overall, there's been a kind of a key shift away. 25% of people only in 2017 of Europeans said Europe should go its own way, to now 2/3 of Europeans. So that's, I think, a reflection of the the one-term Trump presidency, then a correction to Biden, and then, of course, now a re-election of Donald Trump and an inauguration of him as president. So I think what is really interesting now, and I'm not using slides because it's all tangible, of course, and not clear what's going to happen in the future, but to think about exactly about the question of elites, right? So we have this picture of public opinion. So how does that then kind of figure itself into elites? And what we see is that there is a public demand, and I think that's also in some punditry and experts, that of course Europe, even if it didn't want to go its own way, has to in some ways goes its own way, because it's been quite remarkable that, of course, we've seen it since the election of Donald Trump as president, his making threats to two NATO allies, Canada and Denmark, when it comes to Greenland, but also before, during the campaign, saying things like, if you don't pay up to the contribution to NATO that he thinks is fit, and we could argue, of course, about the extent to which there should be more contributed, I will withhold the kind of security umbrella of the United States for these countries. So those are kind of serious differences, right, in the way that we've thought about that transatlantic relationship in the post Second World War period. So then the question becomes, given that we see this kind of transactionalism of Donald Trump and the idea that Europe should, pay up for that security umbrella going forward, what does that then mean for the Europeans? So if you see this demand for Europe going its own way, how do we see that likely to be shaped in the future? So I'm a scholar of European integration. I've been studying this for a long time. We usually think about it in two classical ways. One is there's always a silver lining to every crisis. So Europe gets forced in crisis, in the famous mantra of Jean Monnet, one of Europe's founding fathers. So this will actually create the impetus for the defense cooperation, the common foreign security cooperation, actually economic cooperation, also digital Europe when it comes to, I think, the wingman in the way that Isabel referred to Elon Musk, and of course a lot of the tech support for Donald Trump. This will actually be the silver lining of that transactionalism of Donald Trump. This will give impetus for European leaders to move forward. The other is, and I think Stefano mentioned it, the word doom, the idea that, well, now Trump is back on the stage. We have really forgot to actually prepare ourselves since 2016. This has been on the cards for quite some time, but the Europeans have been sleeping at the wheel. We have not been preparing for more defense and security cooperation. We've not been preparing our economic competitiveness, and we are going to be now, let's say, torn apart, or at least split apart internally through this transactionalism of Donald Trump. And some people are pointing actually to the fact that you see some European leaders, just to say I'm Dutch, my prime minister is not at the inauguration of Donald Trump, but of course the Italian prime minister is at the inauguration. Viktor Orban is at the inauguration, i.e. the idea that this transactionalism is also reflected among certain leaders in Europe that have displayed also more transactionalism when it comes to Europe, in the extent that they're pro-European as long as Europe serves their own domestic interest. Not to say that that's a bad mantra, but it's just something maybe that's different than a clear ideological commitment to the European project. So what we all know as kind of students of European integration, that it's neither doom nor silver lining. It's always something in between those two things, which has often been the kind of muddling through type of scenario, right? We saw that in the Eurozone crisis. We saw that in this quote-unquote refugee crisis. We saw that in Next Generation EU, that long negotiations ultimately lead to more European cooperation in certain forms, but it takes a long time and it's a lot of muddling through. I want to say a couple of things about that. That's the most likely outcome, right? We're not going to see a very clear signal, but it's going to take quite a long time, and it's going to be a difficult negotiation process. So I think what's the key aspect for me to look at as how political leaders will think about Donald Trump is the extent to which this, as I said, this transactionalism of Donald Trump has severed through into European integration in a way that we perhaps have not seen before. There was a silver lining definitely from the Brexit process in the extent that even leaders on the more extremes, far left or far right, that have been kind of more exit Eurosceptic, they have argued for things like leaving the European Union, or hey, you've seen that in some left-wing politicians some while back, but during the Eurozone crisis and more recently, more on the right, that has been dampened, and we see more what one maybe, or I have called, reform Euroscepticism, the extent to which you now are going to reform the European Union from the inside, right? And in some ways, people saw that as a silver lining, but it's also very difficult because what we now see is if you have different ideas about where Europe should go moving forward, let's say more transactional and more explicitly pro-European, these are now going to be pushed to shove because now Europe has to deliver with Donald Trump knocking on its door. So I think the fear that exists among scholars and kind of watchers of European integration. I think it was also very well reflected in a guest often to our institute as well, and a well-known pundit in the European sphere, Natalie Tocci, writing in The Guardian, a very explicit element that this transactionalism that we saw in the European Union, because among certain leaders, because of Donald Trump, gives more purchase to this more transactional approach to Europe, and that might actually not help to move forward on some of the areas. And I think the explicit thing that makes it worrying for me as a political scientist, because European integration actually in some ways did federalism backwards. Normally, when you start to federalize, i.e. when different institutions, if you call it a federal state in the end or not, but when you start cooperating more at a higher level of government, you do it because of security concerns. You do it because you want to kind of forfeit the borders. You want to make sure that, like, you know, a small unit cannot defend against a very big hegemon. So you want to cooperate in some loose form. Think about kind of the Swiss Federation as a good element, as a kind of good example and case in point. But because, of course, the European defense community was struck down in French Parliament, we've seen a lot of pushes towards more economic integration in Europe. So actually, Donald Trump puts that defense issue really back on the table, but we're very far on the economic side, but not very far on the defense side. And that's a very difficult thing to do. We've not necessarily seen that before in history. And that way, the European Union is a little bit of a sui generis in the sense that it's a very different beast than we see in other political systems. And the fear that I have is because high politics is usually more difficult for states to forfeit, let's say, sovereignty to a higher level, that this is now that the threat that Donald Trump poses on the defense side, and we'll see if it really comes to bear or not, is actually puts a lot of pressure on that particular issue. And that's a very sensitive, difficult issue within the European Union. And that's, I think, a very difficult one. The second area where I'm concerned, that is because a lot of the European Union, not only did we basically forfeit our security guarantees to a foreign power, which, if you think about it for a long term, is quite a unique situation as well. But we did it within another, you know, we could have said, oh, it's fine because we did it within another international organization, which is NATO. But NATO in and of itself is now increasingly under pressure, not just from the United States, but we also have countries like Turkey. We have countries that are not necessarily, you know, that we are relying on. They have a very important army, but we're not so sure where they will land on some of these international issues that we outlined. That's Stefano's point about values or more, let's say, core interest. So also within the umbrella that we have, that's under pressure, not just to the United States, but also because of internal divisions within that zone itself. And then I think we're on the third side, and that I will end with. And that is basically, as Isabell already highlighted, the domestic politics of individual member states are now so fraught by some of the similar similar issues of conflict that you see in the United States. So people who are increasingly nationalist focused are also very concerned about spending beyond borders, about sovereignty being put away to a different side. And a lot of the sacrifices that will have to come on the short period of time, a lot of national leaders that now have to do this kind of federalism backwards, that I have a lot of economic integration and now have to do defense integration, are very tied by that domestic let's say, domestic constraints. And here we see just divisions between member states. A country like Spain, there you would find a positive kind of majority, a country like Denmark, a country like Sweden, but in a country like Italy, a country like Hungary, a country like the Netherlands, for example, Austria, that might also now have a more right-wing government, that it's going to be very difficult to kind of convince your publics of that need for cooperation. So just to kind of very quickly sum up, where do I think elites go? It's neither going to be this silver lining, Europe is going to be this crisis moment. We're going to see all this defense cooperation now super quickly. It's probably going to not go that quickly. It's neither a doom story. It's somewhere in between those two things. But I think what's really crucial is that we now have to move in an area of high politics where the domestic costs and the political costs are much higher. And that's not usually how we see that kind of pooled sovereignty establishes itself. It usually goes on defense first and then economics, but we reverse that in the European Union. And now that, for many historical important reasons, but now we will have to kind of develop that defense side, but the pillar in which we did it in NATO is increasingly under pressure, and we're facing a lot of domestic pressure to actually do this because publics might not be willing to do the sacrifices across borders that are needed to actually get there. So I think the landing point for that muddling through, let's say, is very, very narrow. And in the worst case scenario, we can just see a lot of kind of smaller initiatives that are not going to be enough if Donald Trump really comes back to some of the threats that he's made. And of course, that's a big if. We don't know if that was talk or if that was going to be reality. So in that way, I think there is a lot of support on the public side, as Isabell said, but the political road towards providing this going your own way, in the words that the public used, is actually not so clear. So in that way, I am, you might call it mildly pessimistic, mildly optimistic, however, glass half full or half glass is half empty. But in that way, I'm not. I'm just going to be interesting to see why that modeling through process that we're likely going to see is going to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Isabell. I think that you set the stage for the Q&A and raising more questions and giving straight answers, because I mean it's fascinating to see that Europeans apparently believe at the same time with the same intensity that they need to cooperate with the US and that they trust NATO, but they should also go on their own way, and this strong belief coexist at the same time. And I'm also very interested in seeing that they are very focused on security and very worried about security. But in the eupinions survey, when you ask which kind of security, apparently they are mostly concerned by securing borders, which means dealing with migration rather than dealing with nuclear security, nuclear weapons, and 19th century kind of aggression as we saw in Ukraine. So I think that, as you said, Catherine, we are in the middle of the process, and it's not that clear where we will end up in deciding how to react to Donald Trump. So I ask our guests to start with Q&A. I know that probably our director Daniel Gross has joined us, so if he want to kickstart the conversation, otherwise probably also Mario Monti is with us, but feel free to raise your digital hand and to ask to intervene, and I think that Flaminia Belli will help you to join us. In the meanwhile, let me remind you that you can find in the chat the link to the whole presentation by eupinions, and that also I invite you to check out the IEP website, because we have been working on these issues, and there are some policy briefs coming out on these topics, especially on defense. So who wants to start? Is anybody who is raising a hand and then don't see it? Otherwise, I Okay, so I take the opportunity to ask a question while you still think about it. So, how do you interpret this priority in terms of securing borders? It means that basically the far right narrative that migrants are a security threat has how to say has convinced the vast majority of people, and because if you think that the migrants are the problem, you're not going the direction that Catherine was pointing to in terms of investing more in common defense and all this potentially relevant projects. You just want to have less migrants. What do you think?
Isabel, do you want to, or should I?
Well, I can very quickly say I think the extraordinary challenge here is that you need to take the vastest interpretation of security as possible, right? So there is a sense of insecurity on expressed on very different levels, and I think we do not have the luxury to say, well, we're going to address one but not the other, or not the third. And here comes in like this huge difficulty that on the one hand budgets are strained, right? We don't, you know, there's real money issue in even the richest country in the unions. And on the other hand, you know, action capacity is limited. But on the other hand, you could also, and I felt compelled to add to your remarks, Stefano, that on the one hand, they express the need for security. On the other hand, you could argue that they vote consistently in a way that actually are in the end weakening solutions that people like us would call necessary to, in the end, deliver on security. So, yeah, I guess this is why we're sitting here and we're raising more issues than we actually can bring answers, which is pointedly observed, but most certainly true. But I think we begin to find answers by first kind of really detailing the landscape in front of us. And I guess this is what we can help to do here. I'm sorry, Catherine.
Yeah, I will just add a little bit. I very much agree with that. That it's this kind of key, nuanced and multi-aspect way of looking at security from the European Union, and that's maybe different sometimes from the public. Sorry, in different than how pundits or scholars, I guess, look at it sometimes, indeed. But I think it's also interesting that clearly there is a need also for leaders, and I wrote it on a piece on the IEP website, and something that I've been working on myself, that there needs to be a narrative about what the European project is when it comes to this defense side, right? So it's, Stephanie, you said this idea of like maybe Fortress Europe, right? That could be a narrative, like we need to just kind of be by ourselves, close the borders, no one comes in, no one goes out. But then you have this issue of like there's wars on several parts of that fortress, right? But I think the other element, of course, narrative has been that Europe is ultimately a peace project that engages in soft power politics, right? So what it does is, and that has to do with what I said before, we did kind of economics before defense, right? Which you often have more defense cooperation and then economics, is the sense that through trade, through other access, we would ultimately find peace, this kind of Kantian idea of how you create security, right? And we saw, of course, previously in different conflicts, but particularly by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that interdependence can be weaponized, in the words of Farrell and Newman. So Henry Farrell and Abe Newman, who've worked on this idea that you can weaponize these international, energy choke points or other choke points in the kind of world economy, and those can then have a security aspect to it. And I think what European publics haven't fully woken up to, and I quote the kind of NATO General Secretary, is the idea that we have to prepare ourselves of a kind of in a mentality what war might look like in this current age. So Europe is also a power project, and we have fought wars. Might they be in Iraq? Might there have been post-colonial wars that have been fought? So we have done hard politics, but of course the core of the European project internally has always been this peace project, but outside it has, the hard power has played a role. So what does a peace project do when it wants to secure its peace borders, let's say, or its fortress, let's say, however you want to see Europe in and of itself, through hard power? And how does that look like when you no longer have the American security umbrella? And indeed, what Isabell said, which sacrifices or which priorities should be done? And you actually saw this coming heart to heart in the German, the reason why we have a German election now, in the sense that that there was disagreement between the different coalition government parties about how to spend resources. And then, yes, if we want to support Ukraine more, we need to do that at the expense of social spending, for example, the discussion between the FDP, the Liberals, and the Social Democrats. So that's exactly what I'm talking about, like the extent to which Europe in a new phase enters a new phase of where it's more responsible for its own security. May it be, Stefano, at the border, may it be in terms of military power, of if there will ever be a settlement between Ukraine and Russia, that a border patrol needs to be financed through European troops. How do you do that? How do you pay for it? And what's then the story and the narrative about what European integration looks like? And I think that's where we really are. And there is where my concern comes from. If we're muddling through, we're not really working on a new narrative in which we can kind of bring the public with us. So that's as a kind of compliment to what Isabell was saying.
No, I totally agree. And discussing these issues from Italy is particularly scaring because Italy spent 1.5% of GDP for defense, and now in the NATO summit they are discussing about moving the target from 2 to 5%. So the entity of sacrifices starts to seem really significant. We have Andrea Colli who asked to intervene. Andrea Colli is an economic historian who has recently switched to geopolitics and geoeconomics, so he is the right person at the right time. Andrea,
hello,
if you want.
can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Very
Hello, Kathleen. Hello, Isabell. Thank you for your presentations. Yeah, I just want to put a bit of salt into the discussion, because bringing the historian's perspective, Europe has been born, as true, as Kathleen suggested, as a project of peace, as a project of cooperation, largely as a project of economic cooperation, but the roots are in the European project of defense immediately after the war. Defense against what? Ironically, against a Germany that was not clear what was the destiny of Germany going to be. But then, of course, as an allied of the United States during the Cold War bordering Soviet Union. My comment to Catherine's comments are the following. We, in my opinion, we are looking to Europe now as a sort of geographic entity with a multiple concept of borders. Because you have borders on which all the European states are agreeing upon, are the borders against immigration, legal, illegal immigration, most illegal immigration. Then there are borders that are perceived differently from different European countries. Particularly if you talk to the Finns, to the Swedish, Sweden, to the former Baltic Soviet states, Poland, they have a concept of border that is much, in my perception, much different from the concept of border that a Portuguese or an Italian has of the Union. So my question, my comment would be how a common concept of border can be brought into the ideas of Europeans. Is the European Union or the European policymakers, are the European policymakers aware of this different perception of borders or multiple conception of borders inside the European Union and the European citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. I think that's a great question. Of course, I also wrote a book not long time ago that the way Europeans think about Europe is very domestically rooted and very different, and that support or opposition towards the European is a kaleidoscope of all these different conditions that you find domestically. And as you said, I don't know if you saw last week in The Economist, there was the distance to Moscow and the contributions to Ukraine defense. And there's, of course, a positive and negative relationship. So the further away you are from Moscow, i.e. you're Portuguese, in the words of Andrea, the less likely you are to contribute more of that share. And that has to do with the threat perception that is, of course, different in a country like Finland or Poland than it would be in Portugal or Spain. So that's very the case. So in that way, to kind of like translate that to the European situation, now you have an interesting Portuguese leader of the European Council, and then Kallas, a Estonian high representative. So that's always those different views. Let's say in one, you have also the Polish presidency. We've heard last week the Poles are very explicit about Europe has to think about its own defense. But as Isabell would also outline in her slides, actually the Poles see the US really as an important ally. So that's, of course, has to do with historical reasons very clearly, but there's these differences. So if I think about it as a political economy question, so you could see a possibility to getting a consensus, right? So you could see we want more spending on defense, and we do that through joint borrowing. That's a way in which you can get that north-south contribution. The problem is you have Middle Europe coming there in between. So I'm just thinking about the Netherlands, I'm thinking about Germany, where this is among certain fiscal hawks is like the worst outcome of something, right? So you have the federalist kind of bargain where you can actually start spending, but you only do that at that kind of central level. Just to give a little bit of historical background, not that you are so interested in Dutch history, but one of the reasons why the Dutch are so irritated about these type of things is because that exactly happened in the 7th United Republics of the Netherlands, that there was so much debt put by the provinces on the central level that ultimately wasn't sustainable. So there's a historical reason, maybe perhaps, why the Dutch are also a bit concerned about pushing that higher debt level to a higher, and maybe also a kind of strong fiscal federation like Germany has thought a lot about these kind of concerns. So you see these possibilities, but there the question again is the political room possible? So I think these different perceptions could be united when you think about providing impetus spending for southern economies that want to see more investment economies, let's say, and then doing that on level of defense, where you can get a Swede, a Finn, and an Estonian, a Pole to agree on these things. But I think the issue would be the old debates that are there. So I think there is actually perhaps more room when there is an external threat to actually get those type of policy solutions. But the question just is that there's a lot of heterogeneity between member states in the way that you outline that might make that more difficult to achieve.
Thank you, Isabel. If you want to add something, otherwise we have Mario Monti waiting to intervene. Isabel, you want to add something?
No.
We give the floor to Mario Monti, who is apparently is here, but now I see. Okay, Mario, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. A difficult question, admittedly, for the two panelists. I wonder if you can help us guess who will take decisions about war and peace in the new Trump administration. I'm very confused for sure, but I'm not an expert. I believe that since World War II until the year 2000, we were thinking in terms of the military-industrial complex, John Kenneth Galbraith, etc., McNamara, and all that. Then around the year 2000, particularly during George W. Bush's presidency, there was an additional ideological and pretendedly ethical shade to decisions about war and peace. Vice President Cheney clearly dividing the world between the civilized world and the rest, and the notion of exporting democracy. And we saw Iraq, Afghanistan, and all that. Now, is something fundamental going to change? I would guess that President Trump will, in spite of everything, have a key role. But around him, there will be the chief oligarch cum satellites, Elon Musk, the other simple oligarchs. And what about the military-industrial complex in a more traditional sense? Because the deep state, including the military and intelligence, must be rather upset about the bad image campaign and probably changes that the president is entertaining vis-a-vis them. And then, of course, there is the public opinion. But will the public opinion, who is so under the charm of the president and of his magnetism, be a serious friction between him and decisions eventually to make war? I'm very much confused, but I think nobody can answer now, but I think from the idea that we may have on all this, also the credibility of Trump as, Trump reminds me, with all due respect, of Caligula, who is more known for putting a horse in the Senate. And I can assure you that there are no longer horses in that sense in the Senate in Rome. But Caligula is also known as saying oderint dum timeant, that is, let them hate me provided they fear me. So the everything surrounding the credibility of the hard power of President Trump and the US, I think will have a lot to do with his decision-making about these topics. Do you have any idea, hint, or this is just irrelevant, maybe?
No, if I can, I think it's really a key question. So of course, the first response I would go also saw Isabell's face, of course, that we don't know. That's very clear. But I think that what you're alluding to, and that's also the way I would like the Caligula comment, is that this is not, so when I talk to other political scientists, some have this idea, oh, we see 2020, 2028, the midterms, oh, people will be, unhappy with the fact that he hasn't brought down prices, etc. There will be again a swing towards Democrats. And I have the feeling there's something much more fundamental at stake. There's a shift in the way that politics is done in the United States and authority is wielded. Authority is wielded often in the United States in the way that you were describing. We could also think about it as kind of programmatic competition. You had two parties, they had different ideas, but in terms of foreign policy, there was an American way of doing foreign policy. It changed a little bit between more progressive, but it was within an alliance idea, and that alliance sometimes worked well and was used also for interest. I don't have any idea that there was a liberal order that in some ways was more philosophically valuable. It was often also treated with hard force, as we saw in the Iraq in the Iraq case. But I think this is a very different form, and you see that in terms of the fact of who became the defense secretary, which is basically a person who has been Pete Hegseth, who is, of course has a military background as a military personnel, but is not coming from that military industrial complex, Mario, in the way that C.S. Wright Mills, a very famous book, wrote in the 1960s, which was actually the first thing I read when I studied political science, and thinking about the elites. So this is a very different set of elites. And the question with Donald Trump always is that I think the key aspect that I see on foreign policy is the extent to which this is really going to be a China hawkish administration, what some people think, because it is. Marco Rubio has been elevated to Secretary of Defense. There's quite a lot of kind of American hawkishness. That's maybe the only key consensus between the Democratic and the Republican side, actually, when it comes. I mean, Biden was also in very, very much. Or is this going to just be a kind of transactionalism, which is going to be very difficult to predict? To kind of cite Isabell earlier, it's been already the idea that, like, Donald Trump has been in power for 6 months already. That's how it feels, with how much attention is going through this particular case already. That seems very transactional. The fact that there's a Supreme Court TikTok ban, and then which will be quote unquote perceived as anti-China, right? That's one of the main concerns on TikTok. And then Trump kind of doing as you see, the pushback in the public in the US overturning that. It seems to me more like a transactional approach. But sometimes in terms of the world order, that's going to be much more difficult, because that's going to be very difficult to predict what the kind of outcome will be. And it's going to be maybe what particular groups within the administration feel like. And I think that's the sense of authority. This is not a programmatic Republican administration. This is a personality-based, charismatic leadership form of authority, in the way that Weber would describe it, in where the loyalty is towards the Trump idea, or Trumpism, or MAGA. And that is a very key element. Of course, there's going to be divisions internally, but this is not an administration that you have seen in kind of recent years. So that I think brings home the question that you started out with: who's going to make foreign policy in this administration? My honest answer is, who knows? That is just really going to be, the number one thing to watch the coming months, years.
Isabell, do you want to add something about that?
Yeah, I think I just can share my piece of confusion here, because I mean, if you Catherine introduced the idea of a silver lining, and I think it's something we're all looking for these days. So, but when people were looking for a silver lining during the first Trump term, and they were pointing at the non-interventionist nature of the administration, no wars. And certainly no plans for wars. More of, much was made also now before the election of the new isolationism of the US to come, and what would that mean? And then, I mean, he's elected, and then we get the Greenland and Canada, and because Davos is starting tonight, and the inauguration, of course, and it all falls at the same moment. The press coverage also picked it up heavily and kind of replayed sound bites, and it really added to my confusion, because I thought this is so bizarrely contradicting in itself. So my assumption would be, I mean, there is a possibility that is a strategy, or it's just a possibility that it is instinct, the sort of instinct that he has run on for quite a while, and it's tested in this environment as a technique to heighten his power in a system that is very, very difficult to read. And now I think the very troubling question is how if that is true, how will this play out in an international system that is highly volatile, in which impact and reaction are not linear at all. And so the question actually is very difficult to answer right now, indeed. Who's calling for war and peace, who is actually making international politics in the US right now.
Thank you, Isabel. For the last 5 minutes, I have a probably much easier question for you, since you're based in Berlin. Probably you can help us to explain how the German public debate and the German opinion has been reacting to the incoming Trump presidency, and if you see that basically what displayed in daily political events is consistent with the survey that you collected before and after the election.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the possibility to go back to the question of public opinion as well, because I find it very interesting, and I think we should point it out that there seems to be a certain schism that has been observed in the US, but seems to be of a certain reality here as well. That people who are hyper engaged with these issues, be it out of professional reason or personal interest, they put a lot of importance on emphasis actually on what's happening and feel it as a Zeitenwende, as a sea change, as a inflection point, and not only analytically, but I also think emotionally. A lot of tension there. But on the other hand, I really feel when I look at the data that what we now see moving in with it, or we believe is moving in or accelerating with the new Trump administration, people seem to have locked it off as the new normal in international politics. And I think that is also very important to note. This re-election of Donald Trump was not a shock event for the European public. The European public obviously has been shaken quite a lot. The German public is part of it. And the question of war and peace, same as in Italy, are debated very differently than in other countries with a lot of reluctance. I think that the German public has moved a lot on these issues. But we also see, maybe more importantly than a vast majority of the question who stands a vast majority on these issues, is how these issues have been used to split up the political system and have been used by certain political actors to position themselves and fight for their share in the big cake of political power that is going to be redistributed in a couple of weeks from now in this country. And thus, there has been a debate that has been sharpened, of course. But so obviously I'm talking about the new parties being bought out of the situation, which now we have to see whether they move into parliament, whether there will be an even larger fragmentation of parliament after the election. I think the forecasts where we stand right now do not point to that fact, but who knows? Obviously, the AfD, who has been much on the rise, who is waiting right now, following the predictions, to collect a larger share of the votes as ever. But we have seen them being overestimated before. So I really would try to be cautious. And we are only entering the hot phase of the campaign, as the election is in the end of February.
Yes, thank you. We will have the opportunity to discuss these issues in the next few weeks, hopefully so. So I thank you, both of you, Isabel and Catherine, for this very insightful conversation. I think that we will have the next, I don't know when the next survey is scheduled, but I think it will be extremely interesting, and I hope that both of you will join us again to take to understand how the real Donald Trump back in office will shape European citizens' opinions, or maybe if nothing will happen. We will see. Hopefully, no catastrophic event is waiting for us. So we hope that we will discuss this in the same way that we did today. Okay, thank you very much to all of you. I just remember you to check on our website the next events that are already scheduled, and I also invite my colleague Flaminia to put in the chat a link to our new IEP Substack newsletter content. I mean, it's another way, since we are stopping using X because it's not that useful for us and not very consistent with our approach. So Substack seems a more effective way to foster a discussion which is based on ideas and data driven, and not on emotion and gut feelings. So thank you all, and see you next time.